Welcome to another deep dive. This time you've given us some pretty intriguing stuff about Ukraine's legal system and Zelensky's presidency. We're going to be focusing on this interview with Alexander Tupitsky. He was the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. And, well, let's just say his story has a few twists and turns.
It really does offer a look at the inner workings of the Ukrainian government that we don't often get, especially the relationship between Zelensky and the Constitutional Court.
Right. And before we get into all the specifics of what Tupitsky is saying, can we kind of remind our listener about what exactly the Constitutional Court is in Ukraine?
Yeah, so basically it's the body that makes sure that all laws passed in Ukraine line up with their constitution. It's supposed to prevent any one person or group from having too much power over the court system and act as a safeguard against laws that might go against the Constitution.
So Tupitsky was basically the guardian of Ukraine's constitution.
Exactly.
Which makes what he's alleging even more interesting. So in this interview, what's he actually claiming?
Well, his main claim is that the Ukrainian government, and specifically Zelensky's administration, targeted him and the entire Constitutional Court. Basically, he says they did this to stop anyone from opposing their actions, which he says were often unconstitutional.
Okay, and he doesn't just stop at allegations. He claims he was poisoned with mercury while he was in Austria.
Yeah.
He says they found a near-fatal dose of mercury in his system, and he thinks this was because he refused to resign as Chief Justice.
Right, and on top of that, he alleges that there was even a plan to kidnap him while he was in Austria. He thinks Ukrainian authorities might have been behind it to try to get him back to Ukraine.
So he's saying the government was willing to go to pretty extreme lengths to silence their opposition.
Yeah.
What caused this conflict between Tupitsky and Zelensky's administration in the first place?
Well, he points to a few different things, but one of the first clashes was over the land reform law back in 2020.
Oh, yeah, I remember that being pretty controversial.
Yeah.
But it seems like that was just the start.
Yeah, he believes they were pushing it through, even though it might have been unconstitutional.
Huh.
Then later that same year, there was another big disagreement about the anti-corruption reform law. Again, Tupitsky says this law raised some red flags in terms of the Constitution, and he claims the government wasn't happy that the Constitutional Court might block it.
So it sounds like a pattern is starting to emerge here. Tupitsky and the Constitutional Court were basically a roadblock to what Zelensky's administration wanted to do. At least that's how Tupitsky sees it.
Yeah, that's his perspective. And he says they didn't shy away from putting pressure on him.
Oh, how so?
He talks about meetings he had with some pretty high-ranking officials, including Andrei Yermak, who at the time was the head of the Office of the President, and Arsen Avakov, who was then the Minister of Internal Affairs.
Okay, and what happened in these meetings?
Well, according to Tupitsky, they were pressuring him to resign. But he refused because he thought they just wanted to control the court by putting someone in his place who would be easier to manipulate.
So they wanted someone who would just do what they wanted. Did Tupitsky say anything else about how they tried to pressure him?
Yes. He claims they started trying to discredit him by spreading rumors about him living a lavish lifestyle and launching a whole smear campaign in the media.
Basically trying to ruin his reputation so it would be easier to get rid of him.
Right. He says it was all fabricated just to damage his image.
So it would seem like his removal was justified, even necessary.
Exactly. And he goes on to describe how they eventually got him out of office. He says they barred him from his own office.
Wow.
Then he found listening devices in his chambers. And eventually, Zelensky just removed him from his position, which Tupitsky says was completely unconstitutional.
Hold on, they found listening devices in his office. That's straight out of a spy movie. It sounds like he was really feeling the pressure.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And he goes on to say that this feeling of being targeted went beyond his professional life. He even raises concerns about how the Ukrainian government uses sanctions against its own citizens.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah, he argues that they often impose these sanctions without due process.
So people don't even have a chance to defend themselves or prove their innocence.
Right.
That's a pretty troubling accusation if it's true.
It is. And then he gets even more specific and criticizes the government's crackdown on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
The one with ties to Russia.
Yes, that's the one. And he actually uses the word genocide to describe it.
Genocide?
Yes. He's saying that the government is persecuting its own people based on their religious beliefs.
Wow. So not only is he challenging Zelensky's actions, but also calling into question the very legitimacy of his presidency.
Yes. He points to the fact that there haven't been any elections during the war, and what he sees as the government's control over the judicial system. Basically, he's saying that Zelensky's operating outside the limits of the Constitution.
That's a pretty direct attack. Does he offer any solutions?
Well, he believes that the Constitutional Court should have the power to decide whether the president is acting legitimately or not. But, of course, he says the court is in such a bad state right now that it can't do that.
So a bit of a catch-22 situation.
Exactly. But he also suggests that the people who have been involved in persecuting him are worried about what might happen when the political situation changes.
So they're afraid of facing consequences for their actions someday.
That's what he's implying.
It sounds like he's not going to back down.
No, it doesn't. He says he wants to return to Ukraine when it's safe, but he's definitely seeking justice and accountability for what he believes was done to him.
Wow. This interview is packed with some serious allegations.
It definitely is. It offers a very different perspective on what's going on in Ukraine, although, of course, these are just Tupitsky's claims and they would need to be investigated.
Absolutely. But even just his perspective makes us think about the balance of power, the rule of law, and how easily things can go wrong, especially during a war. This is definitely a deep dive we'll need to continue.
Right. And before we move on, I think we should take a closer look at those conflicts over the land reform and anti-corruption laws. Those seem to be key moments in his relationship with Zelensky administration.
Okay, let's unpack those a little bit. It sounded like Tupitsky thought those laws were part of a bigger strategy by Zelensky to gain more power and silence dissent.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. He felt like the Constitutional Court was being pressured to just approve those laws without really considering whether they were constitutional or not.
He mentioned a tense meeting with Yermak and Avakov, where they were supposedly trying to convince him to resign.
Right. He thinks they were trying to figure out how to get the court to do what they wanted without directly interfering.
So getting him out of the way would have been the easiest solution.
Exactly. They wanted someone who would be more, shall we say, agreeable to their plans.
But Tupitsky saw right through it. He felt like resigning would be abandoning his duty to protect the Constitution.
Right. He saw himself as a protector of the Constitution, a barrier between Zelensky's administration and what he saw as their attempts to undermine the rule of law.
And then things really took a turn for the worse. He talked about finding those surveillance devices in his office. If that's true, that's a huge invasion of privacy. It makes you wonder what else they might have been doing.
Absolutely. It certainly gives the impression that they weren't afraid to use underhanded tactics. And then there were those attempts to discredit him publicly, spreading rumors about his personal life, his finances.
Trying to make it look bad so people wouldn't care when they removed it.
Exactly. They wanted to create a narrative where getting rid of him seems like the right thing to do.
Even if the methods they were using were questionable, to say the least.
Yes, and Tupitsky saw it for what it was. He believed those accusations were completely made up, just a way to silence him and get the Constitutional Court out of their way.
This whole idea of a government trying to silence anyone who disagrees with them is pretty disturbing.
It definitely raises questions about the state of democracy in Ukraine, especially during a time of war. And then there's his worry about the sanctions being used against Ukrainian citizens without due process.
Right. It makes you wonder if they're really respecting people's basic rights.
It's a very valid concern, and we can't forget his strong criticism of the government's actions towards the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which, as you mentioned, has ties to Russia.
Yeah, his use of the word genocide is very powerful. It really shows how concerned he is about what he sees as religious persecution.
It's a serious accusation. He's essentially saying the government is targeting a specific religious group simply because of their beliefs.
So he's painting a picture of a government that's willing to overstep its boundaries and disregard the rule of law to get what it wants.
That's certainly the impression his interview gives.
This deep dive has already uncovered a lot, and it seems like we've only just scratched the surface of Tupitsky's story.
Definitely. There's much more to explore here.
But for now, I think we'll leave our listener with a lot to think about. If what Tupitsky is alleging is true, it's pretty concerning. It makes you wonder about the state of democracy in Ukraine and what this means for the future.
It does.
And it highlights how important it is to have a system of checks and balances, especially in times of crisis. We need institutions that can hold power accountable and protect the rights of individuals.
Absolutely.
We'll be back soon with the second part of our deep dive, where we'll delve deeper into some of the specific issues Tupitsky brought up.
It'll be interesting to see where this story goes next.
Okay, so last time we were talking about Tupitsky's allegations of being pressured, those surveillance devices, and even a possible kidnapping plot. He also hinted at something shady going on with that land reform law.
Yeah, he seemed to think that the real goal of that law wasn't about helping Ukrainian farmers like the government said. He thought it was more about making it easier to sell Ukrainian land to foreign interests.
So basically, selling off a piece of Ukraine to the highest bidder, that's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, he even compares it to selling off other valuable resources, like oil or gas. He says that selling the land would be like selling a part of Ukraine's future. He pointed out that lots of countries, even those with strong economies, prefer to lease land instead of selling it outright. That way, they still have some control over it.
Makes sense. So he's worried about Ukrainian land ending up in the hands of foreign companies or individuals who might not have Ukraine's best interests at heart.
Exactly. He's worried about those Ukrainian farmers being taken advantage of. And he actually says that he had a conversation with someone named Serhiy Venislavsky.
Who's that?
He was a representative of Zelensky's administration in the Constitutional Court. And Tupitsky claims that Venislavsky basically admitted that there was a big push within the government to completely sell off Ukrainian land.
Wow, that's pretty damning if it's true. It makes you wonder what else they might not have been telling the public about that law.
Yeah, and Tupitsky goes on to say that the government really wanted to make sure the Constitutional Court wouldn't try to block the land reform law. He talks about meeting with Yermak and Avakov again, and he claims they tried to convince him to resign.
So basically the same tactic they used before.
Exactly. They said if he stepped down, it would make things smoother for everyone.
But Tupitsky didn't buy it. He saw it as an attempt to weaken the Constitutional Court and allow them to push through this land deal.
Yeah, he felt like it would be a betrayal of his duty to protect the Constitution. He saw the court as a safeguard against these kinds of power grabs.
And this is where things start to feel like a spy thriller. Remember, he said he was in Austria when all this was happening, right?
Right.
Well, he claims there was a plan to kidnap him and bring him back to Ukraine to face charges.
He doesn't name names, but he says he heard from someone that Ukrainian security services, specifically the SBU, were involved. They were supposedly planning to take him through another country, maybe Poland, where it would be easier to extradite him to Ukraine.
So basically, they were trying to avoid any legal complications.
That's what it sounds like. And he even brings up a previous case involving a Ukrainian judge, Mykola Kaus. He was allegedly kidnapped from Moldova and brought back to Ukraine against his will.
That sounds eerily similar.
It does, doesn't it? And that case caused a lot of international concern because it looked like the Ukrainian government was willing to bypass the law to get what they wanted.
So Tupitsky's afraid the same thing could happen to him. And it makes you wonder if other countries might be pressured to look the other way when these things happen.
It's a disturbing thought, but it's a reality in a lot of places. Sometimes political alliances come before human rights.
This whole story is pretty unsettling.
Uh,
But then Tupitsky takes it a step further and says Zelensky isn't even a legitimate president.
Well, he says that the fact that there haven't been any elections during the war and what he sees as Zelensky's efforts to control the courts means that he's essentially acting outside the Constitution.
So he's questioning the very foundation of Zelensky's authority.
He is. He thinks that the Constitutional Court should be the one to decide whether the president is acting within the law. But right now, he says the court isn't strong enough to do that.
So it's a bit of a vicious circle.
Exactly. But he also suggests that Zelensky might be acting out of fear. He thinks Zelensky and his administration are worried about what might happen when the war is over, and people start asking questions about their decisions.
So maybe they're trying to solidify their power now to avoid consequences later.
Yeah.
But in the middle of all this talk about political pressure and attempts to undermine the court, Tupitsky also expresses concern about how the government is treating the Ukrainian Orthodox Church.
Right. He doesn't mince words. He calls the government's crackdown on the church genocide.
It's a pretty shocking term to use.
It is. He's talking about the raids on churches, the seizing of property, the pressure on clergy to denounce their faith.
It's happening because of the war with Russia. Right. The government saying the church is a threat to national security because of its ties to the Russian Orthodox Church.
Exactly. They're accusing the church of being pro-Russian, of spreading propaganda, of undermining the war effort.
But Tupitsky sees it as a violation of religious freedom. He thinks they're using the war as an excuse to target a specific group simply because of their beliefs, even though the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been trying to distance itself from Moscow.
Right. And this is a complex issue. Of course, during a war, national security is paramount. But at the same time, you can't just throw basic rights out the window.
Exactly. It's a tough balance to strike. And Tupitsky's perspective, even if you don't agree with him, at least makes you stop and think. It makes you realize how easily things can go wrong, even in a democracy, when you have a government that's willing to overreach its authority.
It's a good reminder that we can't take our freedoms for granted. We have to be vigilant, especially in times of crisis, and make sure that those in power are held accountable.
Tupitsky's story is really eye-opening. It's a reminder that even in the midst of a war, there are still power struggles going on, hidden agendas, and people who are willing to do whatever it takes to protect their interests. But let's not forget, he's also facing some serious accusations from the Ukrainian government.
That's right. They're accusing him of corruption, of abusing his position as Chief Justice for personal gain. They say he was involved in shady land deals and used his influence to sway court decisions.
And how does he respond to these accusations?
He denies everything. He says it's all a smear campaign orchestrated by Zelensky's administration to discredit him and justify his removal. It's hard to know who's telling the truth without seeing all the evidence.
It sounds like a classic power struggle, with both sides trying to control the narrative. But it seems like there's more to it than just that. Tupitsky is claiming that the U.S. government is involved in all this, too.
Yes, he says he was targeted by the U.S. because they saw him as an obstacle to their interests in Ukraine.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he claims that the U.S. has a lot of influence over certain anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine, like the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, or NDU. He says NABU is basically doing the U.S.'s bidding, trying to get rid of anyone who might challenge American interests.
So he's saying that he was a victim of a sort of proxy war, with the U.S. using these agencies to go after him.
That's his claim. He even says that the U.S. imposed sanctions on him based on false information that was fed to them by his political enemies. He thinks they wanted to paint him as corrupt and pro-Russian to justify the sanctions.
Wow, this is getting really complicated. It sounds like he's suggesting that the U.S. is meddling in Ukrainian politics.
It's a bold accusation, but it's not entirely implausible. We know that the U.S. has been heavily involved in supporting Ukraine, both financially and militarily. And it's not uncommon for powerful countries to try to influence events in other countries that they see as strategically important.
It makes you wonder about the true motives behind some of the actions being taken, both by the Ukrainian government and the U.S. Are they really acting in the best interests of Ukraine, or are they just trying to protect their own interests?
It's a difficult question to answer, and I think that's one of the main takeaways from Tupitsky's interview, even if you don't agree with everything he says. He's forcing us to look beyond the surface, to question the narratives that are being presented to us, and to consider the possibility that there are hidden agendas at play.
He's basically saying, don't believe everything you hear.
Exactly. He's reminding us that we need to be critical thinkers, to do our own research, and to be wary of propaganda, regardless of where it's coming from. And I think that's a valuable lesson, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on.
Absolutely. This deep dive has been full of twists and turns. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, and with each layer, the story gets more complex and more disturbing.
It certainly makes you think about the nature of power, the fragility of democracy, and the importance of holding those in power accountable, even in times of war. We need to remember that the pursuit of peace and security should never come at the expense of justice and human rights.
And I think that's a good place to leave it for now. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure our listener has a lot to digest.
They do, and I think it's important to emphasize that this is just one perspective on a very complex situation. We need to hear from other voices, gather more evidence, and try to piece together the full picture.
Absolutely. But Tupitsky's story, whether you believe him or not, is a powerful reminder that things are not always what they seem, and that even in the midst of a war, the fight for truth and justice must continue. We'll be back soon with the final part of our deep dive, where we'll try to make sense of all this and offer some concluding thoughts. We've heard a lot from Tupitsky. Accusations of poisoning, kidnapping plots, pressure from the government. He clearly feels like he was targeted and forced out because he wouldn't go along with Zelensky's plans. But we have to remember, this is just his side of the story.
Yeah, it's a compelling story, but we need to look at it from other angles too. There's always more to the picture, right?
And it's really important to remember that all of this is happening while Ukraine is fighting a war with Russia. Things get pretty intense during a war. It can be hard to know what to believe.
Absolutely. The war's definitely made things more complicated. It's created this atmosphere where it's easy to throw accusations around, and those accusations can be hard to prove, treason, disloyalty, those kinds of things.
So it's possible that some of what Tupitsky is saying is true, but it's also possible that his perspective has been shaped by the war, by the pressure he was under. It's a very emotionally charged situation.
For sure. And we have to remember that he's not exactly a neutral party here. He was right in the middle of this power struggle.
Right, so his reasons for speaking out might be more complicated than he's letting on.
Yeah, maybe he's trying to protect his own reputation or settle some scores. We just don't know for sure. And look, let's be real. Anyone in a position of power like that probably has some skeletons in their closet. It's possible he's done things he's not proud of.
So his claim that he's the victim of some political witch hunt, maybe it's a way to deflect attention from his own actions.
It could be. That's why it's so important to be cautious. We can't just take his word for it. We need to look for evidence, hear from other people involved, and try to get the full story.
And we also can't ignore that there are real concerns about corruption in Ukraine. It's been a problem for a long time, especially in the judicial system.
Absolutely. It undermines people's faith in the government, and it makes it hard for the country to move forward.
But even so, you have to be careful about using accusations of corruption as a weapon. It can be a way to silence your opponents or get rid of people who are just trying to do their jobs.
That's true. And I think that's one of the things that makes Tupitsky's story so unsettling. It raises all these questions about who to trust, what's really going on, and how to ensure that justice is done, even in a country at war.
Exactly. We can't just blindly accept one side's version of events. We have to look at everything critically, consider different perspectives, and try to make sense of it all. But even if we don't have all the answers, I think this deep dive has been really valuable. It's shed light on some important issues that are often overlooked.
I agree. It's a reminder that even in a war, we can't forget about the principles of democracy and the rule of law. These things are fragile, and they need to be protected.
It's been a long journey, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. We started with Tupitsky's personal story, then looked at the accusations against him and his response. We talked about the political struggles within Ukraine, the potential influence of foreign powers, and the importance of protecting individual rights, even during a war.
It's a lot to take in, but it's all interconnected, and I think it shows how complicated and messy the world can be. There are rarely easy answers or simple solutions.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we do this show, to try to understand these complex issues, to challenge ourselves and our listeners to think critically, and to hopefully contribute to a more informed and nuanced public discourse.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you something to think about. And remember, the world is a complicated place, and the truth is often hard to find. But that doesn't mean we should stop searching for it. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp. We'll see you on our next deep dive.